They say in the recovery world that there are 3 days that you just have to get through and survive, and that is Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. Folks who are on a recovery path come to recognize and navigate the fact that there are unique challenges that these holidays bring up. Things around family, things around religion, things around capitalism and colonization that these holidays draw under a magnifying glass. And so today we'll talk a bit about why that is and some things to consider as we head into this holiday season in this time. Before we get into that, my name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, the podcast where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for the revolution together through recovery as a resistance practice. And as we do this episode, like a friendly reminder and invitation to be gentle with yourself, because this season is so charged. There is so much between the capitalism, the colonization, the grief, the memories, the trauma that comes up. And so if, engaging with this feels tough, if you need to pause, come back, if you need a warm beverage or something soothing to listen while you engage and kind of reflect, feel free. Or if it feels too tender, feel free to skip this episode too. So why is it that this holiday season is particularly challenging here in the US empire? One, these holidays are one of the few times that you are really expected to be around family and also really expected to be around substances and consumption, like heavy capitalism kind of consumption. And the conflation of that can be a lot. It can be a lot. All of these holidays are only made possible, they're brought to you by colonization, because Thanksgiving is the epitome of a colonial holiday. It is part of American and American in a broader sense, right? So US, but also Canadian. Canada has its own Thanksgiving, or things taken, as I've come to call it with support of mentors, but things taken, we call it, because in the propaganda of this holiday, it's always about wow, the indigenous people helped the pilgrims to survive, the OG colonizers, and they came together and gave thanks for the harvest that they shared together. This is a colonial holiday. There is just no getting around that. It is and historically has been, about a celebration of genocide and giving thanks for indigenous genocide. And to me, there's just no impasse about that. It just feels so wrong to root a holiday of gratitude into genocide. It's just settler colonialism. And, I think I'm pretty sure Adrienne Murray Brown, a few years ago, talked about, what do we do in terms of replacing things as times of feasting, as we did historically, right? Times of feast. And that's what these holidays are, Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving. They're about feasting and the importance of that, the importance of celebrating abundance and sharing, but maybe not doing it on top of a genocidal holiday, just eviscerating it altogether, and finding another time for gratitude and for giving thanks and feasting. That's where I've been with this for the past couple of years, just wanting to just eviscerate it and find another time to really gather, yeah. And let me know in the comments how you kind of sat with this holiday and gathering. One of the things about, I'll say, the US empire, I don't know how many holidays Canada gets, and if you're Canadian and listening to this, let me know in the comments, but this is one of the few days that Americans get off. This country does not like to give people days off. It works us to the bone until we die, pretty much, retirement at an age where, they've sucked most of the lifeblood out of you. But this is one of the only days that the general populace gets. It's a bank holiday, so the banks are closed, and these bank holidays are the only days that the general populace, quote unquote, right? Because that's what they want you to think. But again, the only people who get off are white collar workers, not the majority of like the working class, like service workers, hotel workers, the people who, keep the electricity on, public transportation. Uh, there are so many people who are still retail workers, especially with Black Friday. Like there is, expectation of like working class folks to still service white collar workers. So that class disparity is also there, even in like who has access to one of the only days that the US empire and Canada acknowledge as a day to have off for this like colonial genocide celebration day. And for Christmas, which again is also rooted in Christian supremacy and hegemony, and, New Year's, which again, some pope decided that that was going to be the new year. Colonial roots of all of these holidays. And so that alone is a lot. That alone is a lot. And then there's, family and family expectations around that. We have different relationships with our families. For a lot of people, that call to family can bring up a lot of things. It can bring up grief in so many ways, whether we have like lost family members, whether we have lost family members to death or to different choices, transitions, or even like, again, colonial impact. Our families might be a big source of our trauma. That might be so much of what we're healing. And then we are expected to go and spend time with them. Or we, again, might remember holiday memories that, bring us back to the very things that we're trying to heal. And so that's really tough, those expectations and that pressure. And again, being kind of told to perform and do this thing when that might not feel right, or that might be harmful, or if we do choose to do it, there may be impact in terms of our mental, emotional, spiritual, physical well-being if we do end up going back into spaces with our family members. So there's a lot to hold, a lot to consider going into these holidays, and just really honoring, a lot of folks are no contact now, or very low contact with family. That's become very big in this generation. So that can come into conflict with these holidays and the conditioning and expectations that they put on us. So big thing with these holidays too is that they really emphasize the nuclear family model. That's like, I've been talking a lot about family on this episode because that's what the pressure is, right? Like the nuclear family. And capitalism really depends on that nuclear family. It is a way that, social norms are spread across generations, social conditioning. Capitalism keeps us isolated from each other because it's like all that you have to depend on is your nuclear family. And so keeping institution of marriage intact, keeping heteronormativity intact, like all of that is also part of these holidays, and like why that's also big. Like the performance of these colonial norms around family comes up, and that might be a really big grief point because for a lot of people, those norms and expectations don't actually match reality. And something that we talk about a lot on this podcast is just like homophobia, transphobia, and that widespread ingrained notion of homophobia and transphobia all over this country and all over the world is because of colonization. Colonization, in part of how it impacted the collective, was to spread patriarchy, the notion of a gender binary, the notion of sex only being between a man and a woman, and that coming into play. And so there can be that pressure of those expectations, and then when we're with our family, not meeting those expectations. Or we may not have relationships with our family at all because our families took that in and meet us in a way that's homophobic or transphobic. And that can bring a lot of grief. That colonial impact being felt in our families on this colonial day. There can be a lot of grief because a big thing with these holidays is around food. And for a lot of us, food can be tricky. Food and pressures around eating, not eating, conditioning around food that we learned in the family can come up. And that can be really, really tough to sit with. The expectation to eat really heavily with Thanksgiving. I want to say too, with food stuff, as we're thinking this year, especially, there has been a lot of shift and revert back towards the, skinny ideal around bodies that we navigated in the 2000s, as well as the 90s, with like the skinny ideal being like that ideal. And so that might be like alive and well going into this holiday season and sitting with food stuff. And, that might be alive and well in the expectations of those that we might be gathering with, especially family again. But also for yourself and sitting with, how is this season feeling for me with all of the messaging that's been going on around weight loss, thin ideals in terms of body, and how you're feeling going into this season where there are a lot of expectations around food, but also how your body should be. And if that's something that you even want to navigate, if those are like environments that are supportive as you're navigating all of this, or if that will bring these things up. And again, we'll talk a bit more about like boundaries that can be set with all of this, but it's something to hold with gentleness because that's like extra loud this year in a way that it hasn't been in a couple of decades. And just something to hold with a lot of gentleness as we go into this holiday season. Something that's also really tender for me as a vegan is how Thanksgiving and the holidays at large are like about compulsive meat eating. So what makes meat consumption possible on the scale that we have it in this country is factory farming, right? So terrible conditions for the animals that are being consumed, but also, the laborers are also being exploited too. And it's, and there's all this around bird flu too. It's all of that. All of that is what makes things possible. And it's compulsive, meaning like this is part of the conditioning, like the expectation that you eat meat for these days, especially when we think about Thanksgiving, like people don't really care for the turkey, right? Like that's not actually what people care about. It's usually the vegetarian sides, the mac and cheese, the greens, the mashed potatoes. That's what people most look forward to, the things that don't require this harm to these animals. And turkeys are also historically sacred birds for indigenous people. So all of that on top of a day that is meant to commemorate and celebrate indigenous genocide historically at its core is just too much. It's so tender for me. And then the other holidays too. There can be a lot of meat consumption associated with Christmas and local traditions about what that looks like for our cultural background. So it's just, thinking about pig, pork, ham, like that's similar, painful conditions for animals and the laborers who have to work with these animals. Yeah, there's just a lot of grief around that forced conditioning of this kind of consumption and the beings that, get harmed in the process. I'm recording this right before Thanksgiving, so that's super loud on my brain, but the expectation to eat and imbibe as well, because there's also an expectation of drinking on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. And that's a big grief too. And what do our familial relationships with drinking look like? Because often like that can be a relationship that goes across generations. We may have heavy drinkers or people who compulsively drink, who have struggles around drinking that comes into question or comes into visibility. If we're on our own journey of recovering around drinking or other substances, like that can come to light then because maybe we don't have supportive family members, or maybe there is like a heavy pressure to drink, knowing that cousins are going to question you, and uncle, like, coming into that question of family members questioning why you're not drinking is challenging. Or smoking, thinking about that, and smoking being also of pressure that might come from your family, or confronting other people's use that may be chaotic, harmful, stressful in family dynamics. I think about the bear and the scene in the bear in the episode Fishes, that it plays out that family dynamic in like a Christmas scene of struggling around, the mother's drinking in that show, and how the whole family is reacting to her drinking, and other family members also struggling with drinking. And so those dynamics can come into the picture, and it can be really stressful. Stress around pressures of performance, because we gather with family and perhaps there is a pressure to be perfect in these times. That was one of the things that was depicted in the show, right? Like a perfect holiday setting. So there may be a lot of expectations around cooking and the perfection of that. There might be expectations around the decorations being perfect, or the gathering being perfect, the table settings being perfect, that your clothing is perfect, that the gifts given, talking about Christmas, thinking about that gifts given, that they're perfect. And that can be really, really stressful. And again, even thinking about weight and eating and the pressures of that can all come into the surface as well, because we may have grown up in homes where there was a lot of fat phobia and a lot of pressure and expectation around our bodies. And then here we are with people who we grew up with, who had commentary and expectations and pressure around what our bodies are supposed to look like. Another grief is too that our families may not be able to meet us with the level that we expect from most people that we engage with these days. Thinking about bodily autonomy, right? And boundaries. And thinking about, there's been so much discussion in the collective around like giving children like bodily autonomy, because maybe a lot of us grew up with being forced to hug different family members, or family members feeling like they had access to us, right? Maybe that they felt like they could point out our flaws, or point at our body, touch our hair, make comments about our hair. And so that can be tough, and those dynamics can come up with family members who are used to having access to our bodies and commentary on our bodies and critique on our bodies. And so that may come up, that might arise, that might be uncomfortable, or that might be a grief. Those pressures and expectations and how we're doing under capitalism may come to light and may be stressful, because maybe we are not meeting the expectations under capitalism that our families had of us. Maybe we are struggling financially, and that is, a strain on different familial relationships. Or maybe our families are struggling, and that's hard to contend with too. Because again, there is so much expectation and performance of wealth and access to wealth. Because again, with all these holidays, you're expected to feast, you're expected to eat and consume. With Christmas and, Black Friday, that happens right after Thanksgiving, you're expected to spend money to show people in your life that you care. And whether or not you're able to do that or do it well is supposed to be taken as like a personal marker about whether or not you care about somebody. And so that can be really stressful, those expectations and that perfectionism. Thinking as well about boundaries, something that a lot of us might contend with is having different COVID boundaries than our families. Our families may have decided to leave any thought of COVID behind, and that can be like a real grief, a real challenge, because maybe you want to gather with family members, but then it's a whole conversation and a whole thing about whether or not family members will honor those boundaries or hear those boundaries. And maybe there's a grief of the fact that your family is no longer taking those precautions, but you are, and the grief of family potentially putting themselves at risk or being sick. And so that might also bring up grief, bring up stress, bring up fear in terms of having those conversations. Another thing that these seasons can bring up is religious trauma. Our families may perform religious rituals or have expectations about performing religious rituals that are specific to this time or the season that may not be in alignment with ours. You know, Christmas, again, because I talked about how all of these holidays are a product of colonization. So Christmas is one of them. The spreading of Christmas all over the world, Christmas being a co-opted pagan holiday, and the expectations of performing this thing. And maybe, you know, thinking about, because I grew up Catholic, you know, the idea of like a Christmas and Easter Catholics, like people who only, and I'm sure this is a thing in other sects of Christianity too. There may be a lot of expectation of like, okay, so you're going to come for Christmas? Are you going to do this? And that pressure to go and do that, or even prayer at a meal may not feel good. It might bring up old religious trauma. I know, thinking about like witnessing prayer, I was having some sensation of being a child and being at church and dissociating, because I went to Catholic school up until I went to college, and it was just a whole lot of dissociating every Wednesday or whenever it was that they took us to church, just going and just having to endure. But my body does not really want to witness like Catholic or Christian rituals or be part of them, even if I'm not saying anything. I don't really want to be present for them because there's always been an expectation that you just like shut up and receive, or you know, be like you have to endure this. And so it might be really tough, and it might bring up some religious trauma being around that. It also can bring up some grief around differing values. I was angsty as hell last Christmas. Like, I was like a ball of angst because there has been ongoing escalating genocide in Palestine, in the birthplace of Jesus, right? Thinking about Jesus, this like radical, anti-imperial, anti-capitalist Palestinian ancestor that he is. In this place of birth, his people are being actively genocided. Like, people are actively being genocided in Palestine. Christmas was canceled in Palestine last year in Bethlehem because they were like, hell no, our people are being killed. Like, what? Why would we celebrate this? And yet to watch a bunch of Christians of all denominations, right, bypassing the fact that that was happening, doing nothing and just doing Christmas as usual, Christmas in like the commercial sense of the tree and the gifts and the food and the color red and green and, you know, the Christmas movies, like, oh, so happy when there are people in the land that Jesus was born who are being killed because people are trying to steal that land. I was so angsty. And so that might come up for you too as we circle back to this season. And while we're here, shout out to the Shaheen family, a Palestinian family that I've been supporting in Gaza, who could use your support. So if you'd like to keep them fed, if you'd like to keep them clothed in this cold winter in Palestine, you can support them. The link is in the show notes. So that angst might come up again this year because we are still contending with it. And there's more escalating in terms of resisting Palestinian liberation, like bills being passed in the House or resolutions being passed in the House to say, like, you know, that Zionism is equivalent to anti-Semitism, stopping bills that would stop the arms like embargo in Israel and all of that. So a year later, there has just been, you know, a bill being introduced in the House that would take away 501c3 status from nonprofits that are anti-Zionist. So, a year later, it continues. The attack and resistance to Palestinian liberation continues. So that might have you feel real angsty. But there's also might be that contention of like a differing of values. You may grow up with family members. And again, this is also really hot because it is an election year, and an election year where there were a lot of closeted Trump supporters, and there are. And that might be a thing in your family. People who actively are voted for somebody who is, saying that they will escalate deportation of immigrants, saying that they will escalate anti-trans, anti-LGBTQIA, two-spirit legislation and sentiment in this country. Folks whose misogynoir kept them from voting for, a Black woman, a Black and South Asian woman. All of that and contending with that might come up this holiday season. And so sitting with the grief of differing so differently from family and family expectations. And overall, the idea of kind of cosplaying family at this point, because we may have really different values and practices from our family, but this is a time of year where the capitalism, the Hallmark, the Lifetime movies, the holiday movies all tell us, and we've been conditioned from childhood, that this is a time of family, when our reality may not match that as necessarily a good idea for us, or an idea without harm or cost. So sitting with all of that, all of the values, all of the different practices, all of the different things that we might hold that are really different from family, and still being expected to perform in this way, or grieving the fact that we're not, but that's what everybody is choosing to do anyway, might also bring another grief. So let's talk about what you want to consider as you go into this holiday season. Because I've just talked about all the ways that it might be really challenging. But what are some ways that you can decide what you want to do about that? One, something to consider might be if you want to do any of these holidays. Because one, they're all made up. I didn't talk about New Year's, but New Year's is also made up. A Pope Gregor, whatever, decided that the Gregorian calendar would be what it was going to be, and that the New Year would start in the middle of winter, when normally, most indigenous people honor like the New Year as the spring equinox, or it looks different in other traditions, thinking about the New Year being more in September in Jewish lineages. So that is forced upon us, right? And there are also lots of capitalist expectations that come with the New Year. The expectation of consumption and being your best life and your best self and wanting more for yourself. And you have to get up and go be productive in the time of the year, and here in the northern hemisphere, right? Like where it will be winter at that time. You're expected to go be productive in the time that your body is like, I just want to sleep. And then you're like, why aren't I productive? And it's like, it's just so silly. It's just so, it's so counterintuitive to how we as humans operate and what our cycles are. And so, but then there's so much expectation and perfectionism that can come up. It's also a big season where a lot of people, start their recovery journeys, because giving up drinking or smoking, using other things might be that New Year goal. My anniversary happens to be around that season. So there are a lot of people who kind of like that's where they start. But yeah, the question is, what do we do? Do you want to even honor or acknowledge any of these holidays? What comes up with you when you think about it in the body? If you're thinking about like being with family members, sit with how that like sits, right? Because I just listed a whole bunch of reasons and impact as to why the season is tough. So I'm wondering if you've been noticing throughout, what came up for you? Was there tightness? Was there tightness in your jaw? Was there tightness in your gut? Were you having memories or fears or visions of the past? Have you noticed how you felt after doing that or performing those things in holiday seasons of the past? So that's something you might have to sit with. Do you go to family and come back and realize like your self-esteem has been heavily impacted? You have a lot of doubt about who you are and what you do and how you live. Is that a thing that you navigate with family? And then sit with it. Is it a matter of avoiding family altogether or not doing the holidays in the ways that they were done growing up? Is it a matter of doing that with chosen family or with your local community, or doing that tradition at home? Maybe it looks like, supporting like a local business, local restaurant, and just like having things taken at home, or, overall boycotting that holiday, not doing anything for that holiday because, again, it is rooted in colonization. Maybe that's how it looks for all of them. Maybe you decide not to acknowledge them because they are all rooted in colonization and none of them feel good. Maybe there's grief that comes up when you think about making that choice, and that needs tending. Maybe you decide to engage and you maybe decide to go to family, but you decide to limit your time with them. If we're talking around substances, considering what you need to take care of yourself. And this tip could apply to anybody, but thinking about, is there like a group of people that you can call to, like a care network or whatnot? Shout out to Umu my former sponsor. Shout out to my former sponsor, Ray, and my friend Layla Mucklid, who we did a podcast episode and talked about like care mapping. But thinking about who is in your circle, like who can you maybe talk about checking in with before the holidays, so that way maybe you take a call with them, maybe you step out and take a walk when things are stressful or when things come up with family. Maybe you think about limiting time with family. Maybe you think about having access to things that can support you while you're in those environments. Maybe, I don't know, I'm having a vision of like accessing video games on your phone, or if you have a Switch, those things are portable, so that could be nice. But thinking about things you can lean into that can bring you some pleasure, things that can give you a little distance. Around substances, thinking about what would support you in being well. So maybe it looks like, if you're struggling around drinking, maybe it looks like having a nice mocktail or non-alcoholic beverage that feels good for you. So that could be, again, a mocktail. It could be like soda. It could be like a sweet beverage that just helps. If we're talking about food, there's a lot to like kind of sit with in terms of just like, how can you meet yourself with gentleness around food and eating? How can you support yourself also in like whatever the outcome is around how you move in this space around eating? Because a lot of times, like, there may be shame, there may be guilt. We may hear that from the people that we're around. And so how can you meet yourself with gentleness regardless of what comes up with food in this space, and maybe set some space, some grace? If smoking is one of those things, maybe having access to like nicotine products or other products that don't aren't like the traditional like smoking of like a cigarette, if that's what we're trying to avoid using. Or, considering maybe you want to only use a certain amount. That could also be an option for all of this when we're talking about use and navigating use in the holidays. If you do intend to use, is there like a certain amount that would feel good and that like is accessible and possible for you? Another thing is also capping how much time you want to spend with folks. Because if you are seeing family, how much time do you want to spend with them? Are you staying with them, or are you, you know, getting a hotel or staying with a friend? What are those options for you? So that way you can create some boundaries of care for yourself. Are there moments that you can take to be by yourself? Is there a way also that you can maybe lower the stimulation? I've realized so much in posts with my neurodivergence that holidays and extended family time was always really overstimulating because it was loud. It was always really, really loud, and that not being really understood, you know? So maybe having earplugs or noise canceling headphones, maybe stepping outside where it's quieter outside of the environment would be good. Thinking about COVID and COVID safety, thinking about bringing masks, thinking about bringing HEPA filters into the home that might help in terms of your comfort, as well as like having folks test, or maybe asking folks to wear masks for a certain number of days before if they are not wearing masks, or to wear masks like indoors and, you know, up until that day. So there's a lot of ways to negotiate and figure out what feels good with you. We were talking a bit about boundaries and boundary setting. And I was talking earlier about family and family with, you know, access to like body or commentary on our body. Like, you know, is that something that you feel comfortable naming? Can you name to your family, like, no, I'm good. Like, I don't really want to hug, or, you know, please don't comment on my body. Is that something that you can do or sit with, or, you know, feel comfortable with? Something to hold with a lot of tenderness with the holiday season is, yeah, family is really challenging. And, you know, often when we're in family spaces, like we can revert back to childhood memories, childhood roles. So, you know, it's something to really hold with a lot of consideration, because there are a lot of us who, like, we will be doing work all 364 other days of the year around healing around family, around recognizing the impacts from our childhood and wounding and things. And then when we're in space with our family, like that can go out the window, or that can really change as we are confronted with old patterns around confrontation and communication and conflict that can come up with family. As again, you know, we talked earlier about like substances and things that can come up in relationship to substances that can come up in families, pressure, expectations, all of that conditioning, the disappointment, the grief, all of that can come up. And we, even though we've done all of this work to like pour into ourselves, and we've done all this work around communication and how to grow, we can recognize that you know, that can go out the window sometimes when we're in family spaces. It can really still impact us as much work as we do. And sometimes when we're in family spaces and we do see that, it can be clarifying in terms of what you want to heal next. It can be validating in terms of like, wow, this was the environment I was in. Because a lot of us, to survive, we may not recognize just all that we went through in our family systems, or how our families communicated, or things. We might kind of block that out, or we may not be really in recognition of it. And so these holidays can also bring that to light. And sometimes that can be used to like get clarity on like how we want to heal moving forward, or just even affirm what we've been through. And that can be really healing. But family stuff can be so tender. So when we're confronting and navigating like the holidays and family memories, because again, bodies are like, our bodies also store these memories. Like our bodies remember the memories of this time. If you're like me and you live on like the East Coast or the Northeast, like there is a very active like shift in terms of the weather and the weather patterns, and the body remembers all of that and all of the memories associated with this time, with family and things. So there's just a lot that can come up, like that can kind of creep up as well on us in terms of these memories of family and this time and this season. So please just like give yourself lots and lots of gentleness when you're sitting with the family impact, which is pretty significant as we're choosing what to do for these holidays. But these holidays are tough. They are. Another thought that comes up is like maybe you gather with other folks who don't prioritize substances. I'm thinking about for New Year's especially, what if, that's a thing and you can see community in those spaces. Maybe you have a local sober bar or sober space, or you can host that in your home or someone else's home, like a gathering that doesn't center substances. And that could be like a cool boundary and practice for you too. So just sitting with all the options that we have. But the biggest takeaway and invitation is just meet yourself with a lot of gentleness, because these holidays are rough. They bring up a lot of childhood memories and expectations. They zoom in on the family dynamics that we might be struggling with and that we may be trying to actively heal from. And so, that's all the things to consider. Peer support spaces might also be really helpful in terms of having access to resources. There's also a link to different crisis care lines that you can call that don't involve the police. But, getting together with community and talking to community about how you're going to take care in this time is going to be really, really critical. If you'd like to continue to support resources like this one, that are, a means of support for folks, you can support us at patreon.com/recovery for the revolution so we can sustain this work. Because, we need each other, and these are things that are challenging, and the struggles are often invisibilized by our family and by the pressure to perform and these colonial holidays. And just a friendly reminder, it's all made up by colonization. So don't take it too heavy. Meet yourself with a lot of gentleness, and just an invitation to practice whatever feels most supportive for you.